All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to MCASA's Expert Training Workshop on Human Trafficking Overlooked Populations. Today's training is being hosted by the Maryland Coalition Against Sexual Assault, or MCASA for short. Thank you for being with us today. My name is Alyssa Garagiola, and I'm MCASA's Training and Community Engagement Policy Advocate. MCASA is a federally recognized state sexual assault coalition. We represent Maryland's 17 rape crisis centers and many other professionals throughout the state who work to respond to and prevent sexual assault. Before we begin, I'm going to go over a few housekeeping items to make sure we're all on the same page. First, closed captions have been enabled. You can access them by going to the bottom of your screen and clicking on the closed caption button. Next, if you have any questions during today's training, please put them in the Q&A box. All questions will be answered at the end of today's training. If you have any comments during today's presentation, please put those in the chat. Today's training will be recorded, and you'll receive a copy of the recording by the end of the week. Towards the end of today's training, I'll be putting an anonymous evaluation link into the chat. We greatly appreciate all feedback as we are constantly striving to improve. Additionally, if you are seeking a certificate of attendance or a certificate for social work CEU credits, you must complete the evaluation form in order to gain access to the certificate request form. Finally, before we begin, I would like to provide a sensitive subject matter warning. Today's training may contain sensitive subject matter and may cause participants to experience strong emotional reactions. We encourage you to take care of yourself during today's training and reach out to your support networks for help if needed. And with that, I will turn it over to MCASA's Human Trafficking Legal Specialist, Mac, for her to introduce our training today. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. It is my absolute pleasure to introduce Landon Dickeson. Landon is an accomplished mental health professional with over a decade of experience in the field. He serves as the executive director for Ranch Hands Rescue and Bob's House of Hope. Landon has worked with thousands of trauma survivors, and this vast experience has driven his passion to create treatment programs for those with complex PTSD. Landon graduated from the University of North Texas with a Master of Science in Clinical Mental Health Counseling. He has experience working with high-risk youth, dual diagnosis, suicide loss, sexual assault and abuse trauma, veteran trauma, and male victims of commercial sexual exploitation. He has been trained in crisis intervention, risk and harm assessment, EMDR, equine and animal assisted counseling, DBT, and many, many more. Landon's passion for education led him to create several trainings to increase understanding of complex trauma, sex trafficking, and overlooked populations. Landon also helped launch the first state and nationwide billboard campaign called #Boys2 to educate the public about the sex trafficking of males. After years of treating sexual abuse and trafficking victims, Landon helped create the first safe house program in the country for male victims of sex trafficking, Bob's House of Hope. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Landon, to begin the training.
Thank you, Mac. And thank you all for having me. I'm super excited to be here. It's a real honor. I'm very much appreciative. And is my sound okay? Everybody can hear me good? Looks like it. All right, fantastic. Please let me know if that changes or if there's an issue at any point in time, because I want to make sure that everything's coming through clearly. As was mentioned, we are recording this, and so we're going to save questions to the end, and I'm going to go through our presentation here. I've provided this presentation at the JUST conference, at the Dallas Crimes Against Children conference, like the Way Summit, and several other either conferences or webinars. So it's something that has received a great deal of interest, and so I'm honored to be able to extend it to Maryland, and I'm grateful to all of you for your interest in this presentation. So I'm going to dive right in. Unseen survivors of commercial sexual exploitation. Primarily, we're referring to males, but there are some other populations that I will highlight in the course of this presentation that are those who have been, again, overlooked. The learning objectives that you'll see here are understanding these diverse populations. I'll be going into those populations themselves and some of their demographic data, recognizing it and addressing the misconceptions and biases that lead to people being overlooked or underserved, implementing some trauma-informed care and support practices. So kind of the basics of and the base C's of how we do the work at Bob's House of Hope and the approach that we take to meeting their unique needs of each survivor. And then, of course, identifying and screening for overlooked populations. This is something that I'll talk about as we go through, but I just want to highlight right now that at least for Texas, we have made the See It tool universal screening, and that has been a very helpful thing. And we're going to see the numbers just unfortunately skyrocket for those who represent a clear concern. And we're already seeing that across juvenile probation centers. Important definitions. I always like to start with definitions because I want to make sure everybody's on the same page. And I would imagine most of the people on this training, but those who are attending for the first time, perhaps, I want to highlight that commercial sexual exploitation, CSE, sometimes will end in a C or a Y. So CSE, commercially sexually exploited youth, is a recognized survivor advocacy training program and approach that is both state and federally recognized. Sex trafficking does need to be distinguished from labor trafficking and smuggling as a trade of recruitment, harboring, transportation, provision, obtaining, patronizing, or soliciting of a person for the purpose of a commercial sex act. For those who are under 18, those things do not need, the force, fraud, or coercion does not need to be proven. It is illegal and it is sex trafficking when they are a minor. The labor trafficking component, again, involves force, fraud, or coercion to compel a person to provide labor or services against their will. What I do want to highlight from the sex trafficking and labor trafficking, and part of the reason I spoke through them all, or both of them rather, is that they often overlap. And we have seen that a lot with the males. They may be lumped into labor trafficking statistics, but they are also sex trafficked. Many of the individuals in our care were labor trafficked during the day and then sexually abused and sex trafficked at night. So there's a great deal of overlap as well as with drug trafficking. A lot of the young men that we've encountered, they have been used as mules, or they themselves have been addicted to substances, and the substances have been used to control them and keep them in servitude. It's a horrific thing, and it includes things like permanent brain damage for some of these drugs that they're given. And so I wanted to highlight that there's a great deal of overlap and cross-victimization that occurs within labor, sex, and drug trafficking. And then, of course, child soldiering is the recruitment, use, or exploitation of children by armed forces or any groups with capacity to use them as fighters, cooks, porters, messengers, or for sexual purposes, often all of the above. We have worked with many young men who have been brought up through Latin American countries, but trying to escape cartel or other gang violence. And this was a part of their experience, unfortunately. It's all horrific. But we're also seeing a higher degree of torture amongst these young men and being bought specifically to be tortured. So as you can see, just from the definitions, there's a great deal of layering that goes into all of this victimization and the recovery efforts needed for survivors. So I added these additional definitions just for clarity as we go forward. I do want to highlight the force, fraud, or coercion component because that does have to be proven up as it relates to adults, does not have to be proven up for minors. So force, fraud, or coercion can look very different across several different modalities or approaches or ways in which that is enacted. One that people may be surprised by, and that I'll get into here in a bit, is we've seen quite a few of our male survivors who were married to their trafficker. They identify as heterosexual or attracted to women, but they were married to a man, and this was part of their trafficking experience. So this is part of that fraud coercion element. So it can look quite different depending on who you're encountering and what the circumstances are and the region that you are in. So the last thing I want to highlight on important definitions is how I use the terms victim, survivor, and lived experience expert. Victim is when somebody is has just had a crime committed against them and has just survived it, or they're still in it. Then a survivor is somebody who has gone through the experience and is starting the recovery process and is no longer in the criminal victimization. And then lived experience expert, this is not something that everybody has to aspire to or attain. It's an option along the recovery path. And it is someone who has done their work of recovery and they have themselves gone back into the work of anti-trafficking to support others and to build on what they have learned and on what the field has learned over the years. I firmly believe that lived experience experts should be the ones leading the field. And I'm really glad to see that is happening and that they're getting paid for their efforts because they unfortunately do have expertise that they developed in ways that none of us wanted them to, and they certainly didn't want to, and it's very harmful, but it was experienced nonetheless. And let's be realistic, counseling, the talking cure, wouldn't exist if it wasn't for people listening to survivors and learning from them what works and what doesn't. And that is why I firmly believe they should be at the forefront of leading these initiatives and partnering with clinicians like myself to find the best paths forward and to create these best practices. So, common misconceptions about trafficking. The first is that trafficking requires crossing state or international borders. It's not true. It can happen in the same state, same city, even within the same household, community, etc. And it's also far more common in rural areas than people realize. Trafficking and smuggling are not the same. A lot of people confuse those two, but they are separate. And smuggling is often an experience that foreign nationals have where they are smuggled over a border, but then they are trafficked in the course of that. So they do often commingle smuggling and trafficking, but it is important legally to note the definition and the separation. Also, consensual commercial sex is sex trafficking. That is not true. There is a great deal of debate and back and forth about where those lines are. The key and what we really focus on is that we're here to serve individuals, those who have been victimized and who have survived the harm and the harms of sex trafficking. And so we don't go into those distinctions when it comes to our work, but it's important to note that that is a discussion in this space. All right, so digging into risk factors for trafficking. Many of these are going to be well recognized by individuals in the anti-trafficking movement, as well as those who have seen signs or symbols or representations of trafficking awareness, where you'll note that there's a great deal of childhood trauma, family dysfunction, drug or alcohol abuse, homelessness, and chronic health issues. What I want everybody to take away from this slide more than anything else is that if the person has one or more of these vulnerabilities, then they are going to have increased risk of exploitation. Hopefully, everybody's aware of the ACEs study, Adverse Childhood Experiences, because this highlights it better than anything else that demonstrates that when somebody has experienced multiple adverse experiences, especially during childhood, they are at extremely increased risk for drug abuse, self-harm, suicide, exploitation, chronic health issues, premature death. I mean, it really has a long-term impact. And sex trafficking, the individuals we've worked with, I haven't seen one person with an ACE less than 7. Most of them have 9 plus. And there are many elements that are not even covered in the ACEs assessment that they have experienced, but that are definitely adverse experiences. So it's important to recognize that the more vulnerabilities a person has, the higher their risk of exploitation, though that does not mean they will be exploited or trafficked. There's a number of observable signs, and many of these are ones that we're all familiar with or that we've heard of before. Frequent running away, homelessness, unexplained cash or clothing, multiple repeated STIs, branding tattoos, unexplained injuries. These are all things that, regardless of how somebody identifies or regardless of how they're identified by others, they're often signs that you're going to see. Now, I do want to highlight, however, that for boys and young men, we are seeing some additional outward signs and some things that have not necessarily been historically identified. One of those is being emaciated. there are many times that we will see females are taken to the hospital for medical care or for STI testing and medications for pregnancies, things of that nature. With males, we're not seeing as much of that. Most of the individuals that have come into our care come in with active STIs. They come in with emaciation, as in they're malnourished, they're dehydrated. We're also seeing that they are um, very scared and very nervous about interacting with anybody, and especially of being touched in any way, including by medical personnel. Many of them have long-term injuries that have never been treated, such as broken bones that weren't set properly, glass embedded in their feet, abscesses in their mouths. I mean, some of these are really quite horrific medical issues that we encounter, including reconstructive surgery being needed. And yet, that is a different observable outward and observable sign, and they're not getting that medical treatment. So they may not be showing up in medical settings as much as other survivors of trafficking or victims of trafficking. So it's one thing that I wanted to highlight and note that is a little different than what we've seen traditionally with observable signs. I apologize for the small type on this one, but proactive safety measures is really important because it doesn't matter what setting you're in, right? You can provide certain proactive safety measures. And I wanted to highlight those really close to the top of the presentation so that we have some idea going into this, why we have things set up and how we can all provide help and support. And this will also build on what I talk about later in the presentation. So the first is creating a safe and private environment. This may seem fairly straightforward, but it's a lot harder to create than people think. A good example of things that you can do to help a person feel safe that are often, I see at least, often overlooked is things like positioning your chair, not blocking the door. May seem simple and it may seem small, especially in a small room, but it's huge for the survivor because I guarantee you they're looking for their exit, even if they're not consciously aware of it. So not blocking that is a huge step in the right direction, making sure there's a clear line, even if they don't ever use it, just knowing that it's there is very, very helpful. Also providing things like water, healthy snacks, a blanket, maybe even a weighted stuffed animal. You can also have essential oils. Peppermint is great for anxiety. When I when I worked on the LOSS team, which is local outreach to suicide survivors, we would carry peppermints with us because there is a very robust amount of clinical data and research data to suggest that peppermint can actually reduce symptoms of anxiety and can help a person get through some of those really intense moments that they have during, say, a panic attack or an anxiety attack, or when they are having trouble with, say, dry mouth, things of that nature because of the high degree of anxiety that they're experiencing. So it's these little touches that can be put in place pretty much anywhere that can help an individual feel safe and be more likely to open up. This is especially valuable and important when it comes to males, because one of the other things that we're seeing with males is that they don't come forward as readily. We had a young man in our program that despite having physical evidence, video evidence, text evidence, a news article from somebody in the area that knew his trafficker that was just arrested for trafficking, and just a laundry list of evidence that it still took him 6 months in our program to acknowledge, yes, I was a victim of trafficking. We see this in juvenile probation. We see this in the CACs. It may take 3, 4, 5 interviews for a male to actually disclose, whereas a female might disclose within the first, second, or third even interview. And our partners, our survivor advocacy partners, are seeing the same thing. So, having established protocols for identifying and responding to human trafficking, universal screening is a huge plus and is definitely something I highly recommend, can't recommend enough, as well as the use of trauma screening tools. Because if somebody scores a clear concern on the CEIT, which is the Commercial Sexual Exploitation Identification Tool developed by West Coast Children's Clinic, if you're seeing that, if you're seeing a high score on the ACEs or a clear concern on the CEIT, I can almost guarantee you that individual is going to qualify for complex PTSD. they definitely will have a history of trauma. Even if they haven't been trafficked or commercially exploited, I guarantee you they have a history of trauma. And many times it's just not been, it's gone unreported. Okay. And that's part of why they're showing up in the ways that they are. And one of the things you'll see as I talk through this today is that males are more often identified via law enforcement and the judicial system, and they're showing up in juvenile probation rather than in treatment. And part of it is because of the lack of identification. So collaborating with service providers and securing referrals, my next slide is going to talk about establishing a local network. But the key here, and the reason I'm highlighting it, is that these individuals need you to move quickly. So if you're going to provide services and you're going to provide proactive safety measures to ensure those services are able to be provided, you have to be able to move quickly. And the best way to do that is to have established partnerships where the partner understands and knows this person, if they get identified within 24 hours, 48 hours, whatever it's going to be, they need your help. So they need to be in for medical, they need to be in for psychiatric, they need to at least be scheduled for dental, they need to be scheduled for a lawyer, they need to start counseling. Like all of those kinds of services need to start immediately. And what I want to highlight from that, in addition, is if you really think about it, when you're telling a survivor, hey, I'm going to provide this, and this for you, that sounds like a trafficker. Because the first thing a trafficker does or an abuser does is build up the idea that they're going to take care of the person, that they're going to help them, that they're going to provide them with things, they're going to take care of them. So, right out of the gate, the survivor, at least in the back of their mind, the alarm bells are going off of, okay, when's the other shoe going to drop? When's that harm coming? Right? That's the mindset, that's the fear that comes with the territory. So, we have good intentions, we want to help, but we've got to recognize that it's a big ask and it's a scary ask. And especially when I don't look or sound like the survivor, it's even harder to establish that trust. And the best way we can do that is by ensuring safety and by following through on what we say we're going to do quickly so that they can see very quickly, very readily, we're going to do what we say we're going to do, and we're not expecting anything from you in return for that. And that is just a critical component of the whole approach to treatment, regardless of the setting. Okay. And then, of course, protecting staff and providing ongoing training. I'm going to speak from personal experience on this one. I had it in my head, and I will own my mistake in this. I had it in my head, clients first, survivors first, and then staff. Well, I was wrong. It should be one to one. The clients, the staff, they both need the same level of support from management, and they both need the same level of engagement from management in order to do the work well and effectively. Because as many people on here, I'm sure can attest, survivors are excellent at picking up on vibes. They're very good at knowing when things are right, when things are wrong, when something's a little off, when somebody's not, quite staying in line with it. It's just they can feel it, right? They can feel it. And so one of the things that's been really impactful at Bob's House of Hope is I established a 15 ethical codes that everybody signs off on and agrees to because it was my way of saying, okay, I can't control how difficult things are going to be from time to time in this space. I can't control that, for-profit's always going to pay more than nonprofit. I can't control, the climate and the weather and things like that, but I can control the culture within my own agency. And we have seen a phenomenal response from that adjustment and that change, both in the staff who enjoy coming to work, who are excited to come to work and do something meaningful and purposeful, but also from the residents who are not running. And as many of you know, running, leaving, coming back into care, it's a common approach or a common experience for survivors. They will often go dark for 3 months and then come back. And so we're not seeing that. They're not running. They're staying, they're working the program, and then they're moving on to the rest of their life. And so I think there's a real value in all of us recognizing that protecting staff and providing ongoing training and having that be one-to-one in terms of how management supports individuals both working in the program and learning in the program is just vital and is important for proactive safety. So, as I mentioned, local network resources, tailor them, get them comprehensive, wrap around the individual. The best way I can describe this is if you think about your own childhood or your kid's childhood, whether you thought about it consciously or not, obviously they had you as parents, or you had your parents or your guardians, but you also had teachers and coaches and principals and doctors and dentists and all kinds of individuals around you in your life, whether tangentially or intimately involved, that were providing direction and care and teaching you skills along the way that you may not even realize were important, that you may not even think of now as an adult. There's certainly been things that it just didn't even occur to me that the individual would never have learned. A good example of that would be proper teeth brushing. I'm sorry, but I overlooked that as something that would need, a life skills development course around it. But it is. And so we do life skills around, all kinds of hygiene aspects of an individual. But if you really start looking at the more comprehensive, you're looking at budgeting, you're looking at how to set up an appointment, how to apply for, how to get insurance, how to, get a driver's license, get a car loans. I mean, it gets complicated. And I can't tell you the number of survivors that I've worked with that have said becoming an adult in the quote unquote regular world is scarier and harder than what I did and had to endure as a victim of trafficking. That may seem shocking to many of us, but it makes perfect sense. And if you read um, uh, some survivor accounts. Jesse Leone wrote a book about it. He's a male survivor. And he talks about this, that in many cases, what you're used to, what you're familiar with, even though it was horrific, you're used to it, you're good at it, you know what to do, you know what to expect. That kind of pressure you know how to deal with, you know how to manage. But these new pressures, you don't. And you need guidance, you need support. That's part of what causes people to relapse and go back into the life. And so that's where you get not only this comprehensive care, the quick response, the tailored care, everything I've mentioned, but also long-term continuity, staying in touch with survivors, letting them know that you're here, even if they don't, need you anymore, you're still available. Because just like your own kids or when you were growing up, whenever you failed at something or you made a mistake or there was a problem or there was an issue, you didn't just get kicked out of your house or your family at the very first incident, hopefully. But many of these individuals, that's what they're used to. They've been kicked out or dismissed or even actively harmed as a response to just making a mistake, just normal human error. And so being there to pick them up when they fall, being there to show them there's a better way forward, and that we're there to help support them along that way, and it's okay to make mistakes, is a really important part of helping a survivor move forward in a full and comprehensive manner. And so getting them connected to resources is absolutely critical towards that. So, as I've already touched on, there's a lot of identifying signs of trafficking, and many of them overlap across a variety of genders and sexual orientations and identities. However, there's a few questions that I think are really helpful for individuals to attempt to ask in any setting that might help the individual access the knowledge that you're looking for. And what I mean by that is we find that many individuals don't know the term trafficking. They've never heard the term trafficking. They've never heard the term exploitation. These words are foreign. And this includes domestic survivors, so individuals born and raised in America and that are American citizens. Um, these terms are new to them. They don't necessarily understand what qualifies or that they even are or were a victim. And this is doubly true for males because there's a tendency to take ownership of what happened and that they made those choices intentionally because they have this undue agency assigned to them by our culture at large. And so as they learn what these things mean and where those boundaries are between themselves and others and exploiters, that's when they start to understand, oh, that's what trafficking is. That's what it means to be a victim of any form of exploitation. So I provide this list of questions here because there are ways that you can lead into that and kind of define the term, define trafficking without having to, kind of unintentionally have a condescending psychoeducation around, well, here's what this means, here's what that means, here's what this means. Do you get it? Like if you just build it into the questions and you make it part of a relational conversation, then defenses will stay lower and there'll be more opportunity to glean helpful, beneficial information about what happened to the individual. And you may recognize a pattern that they have yet to recognize. So that's another reason that it's helpful to ask questions in this manner and to come from a place of curiosity when you're asking, genuine curiosity, genuine interest in them as an individual. So as we talk about overlooked populations, the data is everywhere when it comes to males. It's really all over the map. However, in the last 5 to 10 years, new research has been coming out where they specifically look for males. Historically, what happened is males got caught up in the population by accident or happened to self-disclose or were part of something already that had them identified. But now, when these research articles and these individuals doing these screenings and these reviews, when they're actively looking for males, that's when they're seeing the increase and the up to 50%, which is what we believe it is. So I'll give you some examples. ECPAT International did a study called And Boys 2. They did a second one. And during that second version, they found that it's about 38 to 40% of sex trafficked youth, meaning those under 24, are male. Then the DOJ did a study as well. They found 36%. Both say it's vastly underreported. We've been working with law enforcement across the country and in our local area. When they do stings specifically looking for male victims, they're finding about 40-45%. When the CACs and the juvenile justice departments, when they're doing universal screenings, they're seeing about 40 to 45, maybe 50% that are scoring clear concern. And just last year, NCMEC released a statistic stating that 51% of missing foster care youth are male. And missing foster care youth represent the highest risk population across all other identifiers and demographics. So we look at these numbers and we also look at the numbers on child sexual abuse material, formerly known as child pornography, thankfully renamed more accurate. But what we've seen is that males are represented near 50-50 there. And when we talk to international partners, they're shocked by the lack of awareness with males in the States because they're like, yeah, of course, it's 50-50 everywhere we go. And so I say that and I highlight that to point out that if males are making up 40 to 50% of sex trafficked youth, then that's not an overlooked population. That's not a special population. That's half or nearly half. That means that we're missing a lot of victims and a lot of survivors because of our own biases, our own misconceptions, and really just a lack of screening and actively looking and asking these individuals. The number one thing there's two things that every survivor we've worked with has said when we ask them, what has kept you from reporting? The first is fear. And that is no surprise, right? I think we can all understand and wrap our heads around that. The second one, in every case, and it's very rare you're going to hear 100% from me on anything, but 100% have said nobody ever asked. They were just labeled a bad kid and put in the juvenile system or sent to treatment or ignored, disregarded. They became homeless, whatever the case may be, but nobody ever asked them what's happening or what has happened to you. Nobody has ever asked them what's going on, what's behind this behavior. And I think that's really important for all of us to stop and acknowledge that if we don't ask the person what's been going on and we don't do these explorations to understand the why behind the behavior, then it becomes very easy to just label the individual in a particular way and then not get them the additional layers of help and support that they need. And that's true for many individuals. TGNC, transgender, gender nonconforming, gender fluid, all of these individuals that fall under the LGBTQ plus, IA plus, and Two-Spirit communities, severely overlooked and severely underserved and have some of the highest rates of exploitation and homelessness, regardless of where they are in the country. This is a common and consistent finding. However, I do want to highlight and note that as we have taken in male survivors, many of them will start out reporting, either gay or bi or unsure, things of that nature. And then as they have the opportunity to self-identify and do their trauma work and be safe and not have to do what they're being, forced to do. Many of them say, well, I'm actually heterosexual. I just did what I had to do to survive. And so we're finding about 75, 80% of the males that we've worked with or that we've encountered who are identifying in that way. And so that was a surprise finding for us just because the research has highlighted that it's primarily LGBTQ plus individuals that are impacted. However, I think it's true across many, many boards, many, many pages. And so the more we can screen, the more we can interview these individuals, regardless of how they identify, the better we're going to be at finding the individuals who need the help and the resources. The other thing I would highlight is, in addition to higher rates of homelessness, is higher rates of suicidal ideation and self-harm. Individuals who have experienced trafficking actually attempt suicide about 84 times more or excuse me, individuals who have been trafficked report attempting suicide at a rate of 84%, which is far higher than individuals who have not experienced trafficking. And yet, it is still true that for 15 to 29-year-olds, suicide is the third leading cause of death. And if you look up statistics on suicide, especially in areas that we would traditionally consider to be perpetrators, such as gang and gang-related involvement, suicide is actually a greater risk of death for gang members and others in that community than homicide is. So it's important for us to recognize that there's a great deal of shame and self-loathing and suicidal thoughts, self-harm, and suicide attempts in these communities. They're disproportionately impacted. So I started on this earlier, but I want to highlight a few from this slide about additional signs that we've noticed when it comes to males that may be a little different than what we've historically been taught about female victimization, because that is the dominant archetype in this space. So the ones I want to highlight are the aggression and the anger, the boredom, and then the physical evidence. So I'm going to go backwards with it. Physical evidence would be SANE exams. I've gotten so many calls, some of them 1, 2 in the morning after getting somebody to care, thinking that, okay, we got them covered, they're good now, where the hospital discharged them because they didn't know how to do a SANE exam on a male. And, obviously I can't teach that. So we've identified that as a major gap in services. And so getting the physical evidence can be very, very challenging with males, even if they do, agree to go through such a difficult and challenging procedure. We could get them to the hospital, but if the hospital can't do it or doesn't know, then all that's for nothing. There's no way to collect that. And so that's a big gap and a big challenge here is finding and identifying what that physical evidence is for that individual. And again, it being less available in males. The aggression, the anger, what I want to highlight from that is anger is always a protecting emotion. It's always a secondary emotion, but most importantly, it's a protecting emotion. So if you think about it, what does anger do? It increases your blood pressure. It increases your heart rate. You release cortisol. You start sweating. Your energy level goes up, which means your ATP creation in your cells has increased. These are the things that are done to support the body in preparation for either running or fighting, right? And so if we think about it from that perspective, we have to ask ourselves, okay, what is the anger protecting? Because it's protecting something. We just don't necessarily know what. And so as we ask those questions, as we get to know what's going on behind that, 9 times out of 10, it's some sort of pain, hurt, vulnerability that's being protected. It's just that males are going to show up with the anger and the aggression more often, which is part of what leads to the criminalization challenges that they face. So then the other one being boredom. We hear this all the time from our guys. I'm bored, even though they've got a bajillion things to do and lots of options. So I encourage y'all to note that if somebody's showing up as just bored or angry, then it's probably that they're trying to protect from something that they don't want you to know. There's a great deal of shame or fear related to the lack of disclosure. And so it's not for you to just go, oh, well, never mind then. It's to say, okay, let's find a creative way to explore this further and deeper because more than likely this is a trauma response for this individual, especially if they've already scored a clear concern. And this has just been, what they've learned works. Same with the mischievousness, lying, and theft. It's what they learned. It's how they learn to survive. And if that's how you learn to survive, then naturally you're going to continue those patterns until you learn a better way forward. So, as odd as it may sound, I would even say don't take these maladaptive coping skills from somebody unless you're prepared and able to provide them with a better, more adaptive, healthy um, um, coping skill and response. So health concerns. I've already listed these and discussed this, but what I want to highlight from this slide is the higher incidence of headaches, migraines, gut challenges, and the risk of premature death. Because a lot of these young men, they're coming in with these wounds and these injuries that have never been taken care of. And over time, that stress, that pressure, that harm, it can make it where the individual just is not able, their body has a hard time recovering and a hard time bouncing back. In fact, there have been several findings that those with chronic homelessness, about 12, 13% will die once they enter care because of the shock to their system. We see this with the animals in our program as well. We're also an animal sanctuary for special needs farm animals. And sometimes having gone so long with the cortisol and the lack of food and just the body just trying to survive, once it finally slows down and gets the nutrients that it needs, it shocks the system. It's overload. And sometimes the individual animal and human will pass away suddenly and unexpectedly. It's kind of like SIDS. It's a horrific thing, but it's a well-documented issue, and so it's important that we're addressing the medical right out of the gate as soon as we identify the individual, and then providing that follow-up care that they need and that wraparound care so that we can support both their mental health and their physical health. And then we can start working on their physical health, their community health, etc. So kind of a Maslow's hierarchy type approach to things. So survival sex. I'm highlighting this specifically because males report a higher degree of survival sex than females, and in many cases, they do not recognize this as a form of trafficking, but it very much is. This is again gets into that category of believing that that they chose it or that it was just something that they wanted to do or they chose to do or what have you. It's like, no, it's a forced choice. And the example that I always give with forced choice is if you're sober and then somebody puts a shot of whiskey in front of you and says, drink it, and that's it, well, then, yeah, you have a choice to drink it or not drink it. Maybe you have social pressures and things of that nature to consider, but at the end of the day, you do get to make a choice. However, same scenario, but with a gun to your head, drink it or I'll kill you. That's not a choice. That's a forced choice, right? And a forced choice is not a true choice. And for many individuals, that's been the experience. The force is either, and in some cases, actually a gun to the head, but in others, it's to get, shelter. It's to get food. Sometimes it's to get food for somebody else, to get medicine for themselves or somebody else. In other cases, it's something that is used to get drugs, because drugs become equated to survival in the mind and in the body when you're addicted to a substance, especially substances like fentanyl, which are in everything now, it seems like. So the long-term implications and impact of this is that yes, they chose it, quote unquote, but it was a forced choice, which is not a true choice, and therefore it still qualifies as a form of trafficking. And it's something that requires a great deal of education, both for survivors as well as for providers, and as well as law enforcement. Criminalization. So again, I've touched on this and the stigma and the misidentification and the choosing exploitation. So what I really want to highlight from this slide is the prior experience in juvenile justice for individuals who are identified as adults. if an individual has a long history of being involved in juvenile justice, being involved in various services, treatment hopping, going from program to program, multiple inpatient stays, multiple ER visits, things of that nature, it probably means there's some sort of severe trauma that's either occurred or is occurring and therefore warrants investigation. And in a lot of cases, there was some sort of sexual behavior, some sort of sexual exploitation, or even some form of commercial sexual exploitation that led either to this happening or they were trying to get away from and this happened. Cannot tell you the number of veterans I've worked with who were sexually abused as children. They went into the military to escape that and then experienced additional traumas while in the military. And so now you've got trauma on top of trauma. Well, it's often the same for the survivors that we work with. It started in their family system and then it moved out into the external world once they became a teenager or late childhood, and for some, even in infancy. There is a horrific underground market specifically for infants and to purchase infants for sexual exploitation, torture, things of that nature. It's all horrific. But I say this to say, if you're seeing somebody showing up in these systems over and over and over again, it warrants exploration and not just the label of criminal or bad kid or whatever they've historically heard. It's important to recognize that it may be more that's at play. And also, one of the things I'm really proud of in the state of Texas is we've identified an issue of uh, uh, victims receiving longer prison sentences than traffickers because theirs was easier to prosecute, right? So let's say, for example, they stole a car in order to get away from their trafficker. Real story, by the way. That's a felony charge. So we were able to get that removed because of the circumstances, but not everybody has that kind of advocacy. And so state of Texas has recognized this and is making aggressive changes, which is what I'm proud of, to fix this disparity and to provide services to victims rather than criminalization, and to tighten up the laws so that perpetrators are receiving the sentences rather than the victims themselves. And this is both for male and female and all individuals. So I'm really excited to see that, and that is something we want to see continue. Across all states so that victims are getting the support and resources they need and not the criminalization. Again, identifying these overlooked populations. I've touched on a lot of these before, but what I want to highlight from this slide that's perhaps different than what people have heard perhaps historically is that more research is needed on what do best practices and identification strategies look like for males. That research just is very sparse, if it exists at all. And the literature reviews provide some, context for the numbers. Like in one study, 16% of men compared to 64% of women are disclosing abuse. Okay, well, we have some of those things, but what are the strategies that work for individuals to help them overcome those barriers and actually make the full report, or helps them overcome their own internal biases in addition to the screener's bias? So that these individuals get properly coded to the right services or get properly recognized as a victim instead of as a perpetrator, or get recognized as a victim of multiple abuses. So not just the drug trafficking, not just the labor trafficking, but the sex trafficking component as well. And I do think this is something we miss with a lot of survivors. And I've talked to many survivors who have had these overlapping abuses and these overlapping failures of care. And Polaris, I believe it was, released a study called In Harm's Way that details the ways in which the current systems fail and often fail survivors. And if when you find that kind of data, when you find that kind of information, just know that it's mostly based on female experience, but males in particular, it's going to be two or three times as bad in terms of the gaps, if you will. Now, don't get me wrong, it's all horrific and more resources are needed for all survivors, regardless of how they identify. It's just I'm highlighting some of these additional barriers and challenges that we've encountered along the way. So as we talk through that and we talk through these common misconceptions as it relates to male victims, we've already established that it's probably higher than we think, that there's a great deal of cross-victimization, that there's a choosing element that's just not true. But the other one that I haven't highlighted yet is the first one listed on here, and that's that they're only perpetrators, not victims. And It is not true. Many of the individuals we've worked with have been victims only, no perpetration. We have encountered many who were victimized by a female. In fact, I think the latest stat is that about 35 to 38%, if I remember correctly, of of perpetrators are female. And so recognizing that males can be victims too, recognizing that there's a great deal of overlap, especially in childhood. It is not uncommon for a child who experiences sexual abuse at, say, age 3, and then they become a teenager to then perpetrate against somebody else at the age of 3, who somebody else is a 3-year-old, and they reach the age that the perpetrator was when they abused them. So this is called trauma reenactment. It's a very common thing. It's still horrific and it's still heartbreaking. And oftentimes it's the last holdout in recovery for a survivor. What they did to somebody else is the thing that haunts them the most. Even though they may not have had a choice, or it may have been a trauma reenactment situation, it still has an indelible and lasting impact regardless. And it is just very important to recognize that just because somebody is a male doesn't mean that they're a perpetrator, and just because somebody's a female doesn't mean that they haven't perpetrated. So, getting into best practices, which is always, in my opinion at least, the fun part, the hopeful part of the presentation, because the rest is pretty heavy. But before I do get into that, I want to highlight one other or two other, excuse me, populations that are often overlooked. The first is those who are neurodivergent and or have a physical disability. So we have encountered several individuals with autism spectrum disorder and intellectual and developmental disabilities, and as well as a physical disability. In fact, there's one article that I read that said, research article that is, that put it at 6 times greater rate of trafficking than those who are neurotypical or who do not have a physical disability. So roughly, to put that in perspective, roughly 2% of the American population will experience trafficking at some point in their lives, which is still way, way, way too many, but we know it's also underreported. So it's probably higher than that. For those who have a severe physical or mental disability, that number is 12%. What I really want to highlight from this is that 2% I mentioned is known trafficking, right? And we've said it's underreported. Same for this other group, for the neurodivergent and physical disabilities group. This 12% is known trafficking, known abuse, not just projected or possible. And so it is most likely much higher as well because these individuals struggle with reporting. They make what we call poor historians. So a good example of that is our third resident, when we opened the safe house in June of 2021, was a young man that fell into this category and was mute for about the first month or two in our care. But over time started to open up and got the help and support he needs. And now he's in a lifelong care home and he's happy and healthy and everything, which is just so exciting. But I digress. The point I'm getting at is he called his traffickers bullies. He said what he liked about Bob's House of Hope is that it was a bully-free zone. The first time we heard that, we thought it was very sweet. We thought, oh, that's a really great way to put it. But what we didn't realize until more time passed and more interviews is that he was referring to those who had sexually abused him, who had trafficked him right off the streets of Denton here in Texas. And that's horrific, but it made it hard for us in law enforcement to do the interviews that we needed to do to then go after and get justice for him because timelines were off, terminology was difficult to understand. We ended up taking him to the CAC so that he could have a forensic interview like you would with a child. And so CAC, by the way, I don't know if the terms are the same in Maryland, but it's Children's Advocacy Center. So I say all that to say that's another population that is vastly underreported and vastly underserved, but have higher needs and therefore require more services and more support. The other group would be our indigenous youth. Those who are indigenous, and especially those who are indigenous two-spirit, they are vastly underrepresented and they have really extreme situations that are different than those who are not indigenous. And a good example of that would be man camps. I don't have time to go into that, but I highly recommend you read up on man camps as it relates to the trafficking of indigenous youth. So those are just two populations that I want to make sure that I'm highlighting and noting because they require additional attention and specific efforts and interventions unique to their populations. So digging into best practices. if you take nothing away from what I've told you today, from this presentation today, please take this. Recovery requires safety, then trust, then connection. You cannot skip a step. There are most things that I'll say, well, it depends, classic counselor answer. Oh, you could do this, you could do that. No, with this, it is this. It has to be physical and felt safety, which leads to stability. That then translates into trust, building trust. And then from trust, we create connections. And it's only in connections with ourselves and others that we're able to recover. Being harmed, separation of relationships, severing of connections and trust and safety is what got us here in the first place. Unfortunately, it's the repair of that that is required for recovery. And that takes time, that takes repetition, that takes meeting the needs holistically and practically. It means listening, it means understanding, it means, total informed consent. A lot of things go into this because, again, if you think about your own childhood or your own children, all those things that came around you in the course of your development, many of these survivors didn't have. They didn't encounter it, or they did it, it was very sparing, or sparse rather, or the people who were supposed to provide that are the ones who actually actively perpetrated them repeatedly. And so that adds to the layers of attachment wounds that are so critical for recovery and part of why it takes longer to recover from these types of abuses or these types of traumas compared to others. It's not to minimize other types of trauma. It's just to point to the way that it impacts an individual's development looks different, and therefore the recovery process looks and is experienced in a different way. So being able to recognize all that and be patient with relapses and mistakes is just part of it. And it's part of us giving individuals the space they need to recover. I mentioned Maslow's hierarchy of needs. I would imagine most people are familiar with it. So what I want to highlight is that achieving stability and achieving felt safety is not the same as physical safety. Earning trust with others, developing trust with others is not equivalent to trusting self. So as we look at these things, yes, it's within our purview to maybe provide some of these elements on the pyramid, but a lot of this requires the individual. And if you think about it from the perspective of, say, self-harm, for example, well, that's an individual violating their own felt safety internally without anybody else being involved necessarily. And so I understand it as a maladaptive coping skill, but it is still that maladaptive. It is still harmful. And you cannot consider a place, a location, and a relationship safe if they are actively hurting you mentally or physically. So developing that internal safety and that felt safety in the world is just as important, in fact, more important in many ways than physical safety, but you have to have both. And so I highlight this because I have seen over and over the lack of attention to felt safety and how people go straight for trust and developing trust with an individual, or having them develop trust within themselves, right? Again, the challenge with that is the person may not be ready for that. They may not know how to establish that. And if they're not safe, then you're gonna keep getting derailed in that trust to connection process. So what I always tell my staff is if you ever get stuck with an individual in therapy or in life skills or whatever intervention, always take it back to safety. Because if you stick to safety and first do no harm, then you can only build good off of that. At least you're not hurting, right? And sometimes helping can hurt. We have to acknowledge that. Sometimes we can hurt in the course of trying to help. So if we always take it back to felt safety and establishing what is safe for that person, then we are going to do at least no harm, which gives us a very firm foundation to build ever increasing and impactful interventions from that solid foundation. So just like the pyramid, right? The bottom is wider. So building that gives us the opportunity and gives them the opportunity to reach those higher levels. Again, safety. I've highlighted some of these things. What I want to note on this slide as you read through it that is maybe above and beyond what I've previously discussed is total informed consent and development of access to resources. So with every individual that comes into our care and with every client that I see in counseling, I want to work myself out of a job. And so part of how I do that is ensuring that they have the resources, the knowledge, the information, the everything that they need to go replicate the positive results they've experienced on their own. I know somebody's ready for the next level or even ready to graduate if they can explain to me how they got to where they are, that brought them to counseling, how they got out of it, and then how they're going to use those things that they learned in the future in case things go south or they have another negative experience or a trauma. Doesn't mean not asking for help. In fact, that's a critical component is learning how to ask for help and when and not letting it get as bad, right? So rebuilding their lives is not our job, so to speak. It's part of our duty to help show them that. But at the end of the day, the point is them learning it, taking ownership of it, and reparenting themselves in many ways so that you can have a functional adult as they move forward in the world. Because the other piece of this that I think is worth highlighting is that when individuals experience extreme trauma and especially repeated abuses over years by multiple people during key developmental stages of childhood and adolescence, many times that timestamp of trauma in the brain derails normal development. And so you may see an 18, 19, 30-year-old male, 50, 60, who sucks their thumb and carries around a stuffed animal when they're really stressed out. Well, that tells me that there was something that happened in early childhood that was traumatic and they didn't get past that certain developmental milestone. So we actually created a level system within our program that mirrors the stages of development. And we work individuals through that and help guide them through that with the hope and the intent that by the time they graduate, their chronological age will match their developmental age and vice versa, or at least be much closer to it. So I wanted to highlight that as part of what I mean by comprehensive, multidisciplinary, total wraparound, holistic, etc. And then the last piece of that I want to talk about is the total informed consent. I'll go to the next slide while I'm talking about it. Um, Total informed consent is giving the individual what will happen, what won't happen, what might happen, what will definitely not happen, what maybe down the road could happen, and then giving them the opportunity to think through and process through all of those different elements, everything that comes up or that could come up. That is total informed consent. And I'm a big believer in it because one, I believe people can make informed choices when they have all the information. But two, these individuals, even when they're teenagers, they've had to make horrific decisions. They've had to make horrific choices on very little information, many of which were, life and death decisions, but they had to make it on very little information. So they've already had experience making really, really tough decisions, but without all the information or without somebody to support them in their decision-making process. That's part of our job, not to decide for them, not to tell them what to do and how to do it exactly, but to give them the tools needed to make informed choices and then provide the guidance and the support needed for them to make those choices as they move forward, but then also to be there as a safety net when they make a mistake. Because just like any other teenager, just like any other kid, just like any other adult, definitely me included, I've made plenty of mistakes. I hope that people will be there that care about me and that want the best for me to pick me up and help me move forward, help me correct and grow, not penalize me, not think less of me, not dismiss me or get rid of me or kick me out. Like, yes, there are certain lines that are uncrossable. I understand that. But up to and including those uncrossable lines, it's my belief that we should be providing as much support and resources and guidance as we can. And as a extension of that, I'm a big believer in natural consequences. So I give you a quick story. We had a young man from a Latin American country who came in very, very angry. And the way this still blows my mind to this day, the way he and his friends solved arguments, disagreements, was with a knife fight. So whoever won the knife fight won the argument or the disagreement. So naturally, he had kind of a warped perspective on conflict resolution, a harmful perspective. And one day he got upset and he knew the rules, that there's no physical violence in the house or in the program. And instead, which I'm good on him, he went to his room and punched a hole in the wall. Um, well, I came in to talk to him and he was upset, but and then he started crying and he was at the end of the day terrified that we were going to kick him out. And so we talked through the anger, we talked through the fear, we talked through, the hurt, the things that came up. And then at the end, he asked me, "Are you going to kick me out?" And I said, "No, I'm not going to kick you out, but I am going to teach you drywall repair and painting." So this is what I call trauma-informed accountability. I'm holding the individual accountable for the ways in which they've harmed or wronged their community, in this case, the house, Bob's House of Hope, but I'm doing it in a trauma-informed way that resonates with what they've experienced and with how to move forward rather than just penalizing or kicking out. So to me, this is part of how we establish that safety, that trust, that stability, but also maintain that connection that is part of recovery. And this gives them a better template moving forward. This is empowerment. This is hope, in my opinion. I know they're going to be chaotic. I know they're going to self-sabotage. If anything, when you grow up in a chaotic environment and you learn to make do and get by in that environment, you conflate chaos and safety. And so what ends up happening is when you finally feel safe for the first time, it's scary, it's different, and so your defenses come up. And a common defense is self-sabotage. The best way to think of self-sabotage is a shield, something you're using to protect yourself, but also the very thing that you're using to bash yourself in the face and cause yourself harm. So the point being, yes, you're safe, but you're trying to defend against that safety and harming yourself in the process. That's self-sabotage in a nutshell. And so the more we can help break that down for individuals and show them a better way forward, the better they're going to be for their long-term recovery. So a lot of this on trust, I've already kind of gotten into a little bit at a high level, but what I want to dig into is the consistency, the reliability, the demonstration of healthy boundaries, and the being real and being genuine. As we said earlier, they pick up on vibes. Their BS meters are very strong, and they had to be to survive, right? So if you're not being real, if you're not being genuine, they're gonna know. Even if you think you're hiding it well or you're a good actor, they're gonna know. And so it's really important that we're modeling what it means to be a healthy adult, and that includes things like being willing to say, "I don't know. I don't have the answer. Let me go find that out." Or apologizing when you make a mistake and showing them, demonstrating you can make a mistake, you can own it, you can apologize, and bad things don't happen. That's part of how apologies work. You own what you did, you apologize for it, and then you put things in place to not make the same mistake again. Simple. So, but it's not something they've learned, right? It's not something that they've been taught or that they've had the safety net to make the mistakes in the course of learning it and still be, within that support system. So I highlight that as part of trust because trust is so easy to break, so hard to gain. And I'm just going to tell you right now, if you haven't experienced this already, you will at some point. You will break their trust. That is going to happen, whether you like it or not. Even if you do everything right, it's still going to happen sometimes. We're all human. It's the nature of being human. To err is human, right? So it's about how do you show them where those boundaries and lines are between what is just an accidental breach of trust and what is an intentional harmful breach of trust, where the individual is trying to hurt you, teaching them those boundaries, but then also showing them here's how you rebuild it, because they're also going to break our trust. They're going to do the wrong thing as well. It's about showing them not just accepting it or letting it go, but showing them, okay, here's how we come back from severed trust. And here's how we reestablish the safety that's necessary to build said trust, which then leads to connection and recovery, right? So these are the kind of things that I could do an entire presentation on separately, but I want to highlight them at a high level for everybody. And the last one, of course, being connection. So I'm a big believer in modeling. So modeling healthy behavior, modeling healthy intimacy, using appropriate self-disclosure. So, for example, healthy intimacy might be I'm petting the dog or a cat or a horse or something and talking them through what I'm doing, why it matters, how it makes me feel, how it makes the animal feel, how I'm respecting the animal's boundaries, even within that touch. Like animals are a huge support for healthy intimacy because they don't come with that agenda or that possibility of a sexual agenda or some other need or desire of the person. So if you have that opportunity, great. But if you don't, you can still talk through what those things mean, and you can still do things like fist bumps or asking for a handshake or side hug, things of that nature, right? So just being careful not to cross those lines, but talk them through with the individual. Set the expectation, but also show them what it looks like and and help them talk through those lines with you and do kind of a parallel process. That's what I mean by side activities, where you're like, instead of just saying, go, I don't know, clean the windows, show them how. Go do it with them, right? Taking out the trash, do it with them. Do things side by side and show what that companionship and that doing it together and learning and growing together, what that looks like. And explaining it as you go. I'm a big believer in explaining the why behind things. And when it comes to personal disclosure, the focus there is you don't share anything that's going to make it about you. So if you want to say, for example, they're talking to you about suicidal ideation and you say something to the effect of, man, I've been to that low place too, or I've had friends that have been in that low place. Something that represents that you do understand, that you have experience with it, but that doesn't go into the details of your own experience and unintentionally make it about you or make the survivor believe that they need to support you in some way or take care of you instead. So, protective factors. And for the sake of time, I'm going to go a little faster with some of these. I've also already touched on a lot of them, so I want to highlight a few as we wrap up the presentation here. So, demonstrating trust and demonstrating how it's different than the distorted or disguised tactics used by abusers and traffickers in the past can be a very difficult and challenging intersection to navigate. And so this is where I say the consistency and the repetition becomes so, so, so important. Trauma-informed accountability, as I just mentioned earlier. I'm going to apply those strategies. I'm going to apply those approaches and those concepts across every resident, across every staff member, and across myself, right? It's got to be consistent and it's got to be repeatable. And they have to see that over and over and over again. Because if you think about this from their point of view, if somebody has taught you that your only value is how you can, help others feel good or what you can do for others, or that you have no value, all the awful possibilities, you've probably said that to yourself multiple times over multiple years, every single day. Even if it's just one bad line a day, that's still 365 days times however many years. That's a lot of repetition. It's going to take repetition in the other direction to also correct that, to also change that. We call it cow trails because we work on a ranch. So if you build a fence across a cow trail that leads to water, they will run into the fence and they will die. They will not find a new path. What you have to do is teach them a new path over and over and over and over until they start following that one. Then you build a fence across the old trail. That's how they learn. It's the same with the brain, really. It's associations and it's repetition of those associations that leads us to changing the direction and the go-to response that happens in our mind when things come up, especially things that are traumatic. So, other things you can do to help yourself as you're going through understanding working with these individuals. One is aggression is not always hostility. And two, lying is a learned survival skill. So don't take these things personally. Recognize the separation. Recognize that it has something to do with the other individual rather than, something specific to you, or it's not necessarily that it's malicious. It's sometimes just a response, just a gut reaction. And in those cases, it requires teaching a more adaptive response and a calm, steady reinforcement of, yeah, I know that you lied, but I'm still here, and here's how we're going to work through it moving forward. Okay. And you can't do that if you take it as a personal offense. Cultural differences absolutely influence treatment. And so it's really good to maintain some curiosity and awareness that my lens of life is not necessarily the same as theirs, and be willing to learn and grow and to be adaptable because not all models of treatment and recovery are going to fit for each individual. So you've got to have a certain degree of flexibility. I call it structured enough to be flexible. You got to be structured and stick to fidelity to your model, but have some flexibility built in there, right? So that you can adjust as things change. So, I've already touched on these. Again, this not blocking doors, food and comfort, setting clear boundaries. This is also important for you, though. The consistency and repetition is just as important for you and your long-term involvement in this space as it is for them, because burnout, vicarious trauma, these are very real things. Primary trauma, even, especially if you're working in residential settings. It's possible. It happens. So setting things up in a way that keeps you safe and stable and your team safe and stable is just as important, because if you don't feel safe, how are you going to help them feel and stay safe? So some of the other elements of that include body posture and body language, being confident in what you're doing, what you're saying, knowing your stuff, avoiding cliches, saying I don't know, addressing the incongruence or the destructive congruence that they're experiencing. The best way to think about that is your body, or excuse me, yeah, your body sensations, your emotions, and your thoughts should all be in alignment. That's congruence. That's what we always want to move towards. However, that can turn into destructive congruence, which is where you have a thought that I'm worthless, then you feel sad, and then your body symptoms are depressed. Well, that's congruent. And so in many cases, you can actually end up kind of falling into that and becoming comfortable with that rather than being able to move through it, because there's a comfort in that congruence. So in many cases, we kind of have to go through incongruence in order to get to a healthy congruence, which would be something like I have worth, I have value, feeling happy, and then having upregulated, warm, fuzzy, positive emotions or sensations in the body. Okay. So trusting others is not equivalent to trusting self, as I said earlier. Here's some ways that you can teach the individual to do that, to find that trust in others and that trust in themselves. It's a constant feedback loop. And this is again where keeping these things for yourself and taking care of you and getting constant clinical supervision while you're doing the work with these individuals is critical. And these are the kind of skills that I have listed here that I would be happy to provide additional learning materials on and send people references to learn and grow and read more on these topics, because each of these really can be its own course, its own lecture. And then the last couple of things on as we wrap up here today, and then I'll have time for about 10 minutes for questions, is continuing to remove obstacles from their path, staying in the here and now, and providing appropriate transparency and self-disclosure through modeling, um, emphasizing that treatment failures are not personal, and that just because somebody failed does not mean that they're a failure or that you're a failure or that the treatment's not working. It just sometimes these things take time. So these mistakes are ones that I've kind of highlighted as we've gone along and as I've talked about it, but they're ones that I really want people to be mindful of, and feel free to take a picture or a screenshot, because these are the things that I see most often getting in the way of staff from being able to provide the support and resources in an effective and consistent manner. Um, Again, it's about taking care of you just as much as it is them and taking care of your staff. So self-care is not selfishness. It is part of doing good work and taking care of one another, and taking care of yourself is critical for longevity in this space. As you all know, we're mandated reporters, those of us who are clinicians. I don't know the exact laws in the state of Maryland, but I know in the state of Texas, we have 48 hours to report. We have a dedicated line that we call. I'm sure y'all have a very similar process for mandated reporting for those who are a minor, an elderly person, or someone with a disability. The Trafficking Victims Protection Act, I also want to mention, it has a 3P framework that includes protection, prevention, and prosecution. And this is what the U.S. government uses as a standard across the country for prosecuting these cases, as well as recognizing individuals who have been trafficked. And those who are foreign nationals can receive their OTIP letter through the Office of Trafficking in Persons, OTIP, right, as part of being identified as a victim of a severe form of trafficking under this framework. I provide a few questions and recommendations here simply to say, what are we missing? How can we fill gaps? What do we need to improve services, especially for overlooked populations? And then just the need for more research, the need for establishing best practices in this space, and for more clinicians having an in-depth understanding of complex PTSD and how to treat it and how people recover from it, and providing this ongoing and intensive training for people in this space so that we're not just filling gaps, we're providing quality services that allow individuals to go on and have a full and productive life without requiring continued services. So here's my list of references, which I'll leave up, and then I'll turn it over to Mac and Alyssa to open up for questions with the little bit of time that we have left. But I wanted to make sure y'all saw this because this is where I pulled a lot of my info from. So thank you.
Thank you so much, Landon, for that wonderful presentation. So we will open it up for questions. I also just put the evaluation form into the chat. We greatly appreciate all feedback as we are constantly striving to improve. If you are seeking a certificate of attendance or a certificate for social work CEU credits, you must complete the evaluation form. Upon submitting the evaluation form, you'll gain access to the certificate request form. I'll send out an email by the end of the week with a copy of today's video recording, a supplemental resource guide, and the evaluation link. So thank you all so much for coming, and again, we will stick around for questions.